questions early on. All right, like I say, we're here for Discharge to Assess an Occupational Perspective. I'm Adam Ferry. I'm an occupational therapist and one of the directors of the OT service. To put a bit of context on my clinical experience, so you feel like I'm qualified to talk about the topic. When I graduated in occupational therapy in 2007, like a lot of people did, I went straight into a hospital-based role. At that time, it was a rotation, and then spent 12 years within hospital services, so pure inpatient services. Within those 12 years, saw an awful lot of change in how inpatient processes, discharge processes, leading to just as I was leaving, which is before I left the NHS to work full-time in the private sector, the implementation of a discharge to assess model. So my experiences and my reflections cover a lot of that, as well as going through what the legislation actually says discharge to assess should be, how it should be applied, and whether that matches your experiences, what the challenges and opportunities are around that. So I hope that's okay for you all. Get my buttons right. So the objectives within the webinar are to consider the aim of discharge to assess and its impact on NHS and local authority occupational therapy services, to review the legislation to reflect on discharge to assess and its application nationally. Obviously, the majority of my experiences are either going to come from my own clinical experiences in the region that I'm in, or in supervising occupational therapists across the country and their experiences and their rhetorical feedback. We're going to reflect on the potential benefits and challenges to occupational therapy practice posed by discharge to assess, and consider the impact on clinical reasoning processes within bathing. I put within bathing because I use bathing as the clinical example in this case, but they're transferable across anything. So there's some relatively dry bits to go through first. I'm going to try and make them interesting for you. But I think it's really important that when we are discussing the impact of discharge to assess, we understand where it came from and actually what it's meant to be, how it's meant to be used, and what it's meant to achieve. So we're going to look at 4 key documents. One is the National Audit Office discharging older people from hospital from 2016. We're going to look at the NICE guideline, transition between inpatient hospital settings and community or care home settings for adults with social care needs from 2016. We're going to reduce the document, reducing delays in hospital transfer of care for older people, key messages in planning and commissioning, and hospital discharge service policy and operating manual from last year. So that was revised during COVID and the initial lockdown to make some changes, and then reverted back during the summer. So that's that document, really important one to look at the minute. So the NAO, the National Audit Office discharge of older people from hospital, it's where some statistics were being developed around hospital discharge and updated. So it says 62% of hospital bed days are occupied by patients of age 65 plus. It says 1.15 million bed days are lost to reported delayed transfers of care. The estimate is that actually that's 2.7 times higher than that, but that's based on information on data gathering from trusts. It says there are 2.7 million estimated bed days occupied by older patients no longer needing acute care, and that 54% of hospitals said that discharge planning did not start early enough for older people. It recommended early identification of needs and it recommended that health and social care commissioners need to know good practice, including the NICE guidelines, in patient flow to reduce the number of older patients unnecessarily delayed. Interestingly, for me, when I was reading through the legislation, the term delayed transfers of care, what it refers to as a delayed transfer of care, and it's important that we remember this, it clearly says that a delayed transfer of care is where the entire multidisciplinary team feels that a discharge or a transfer has been optimized within that setting. After that point, then it would become a delayed transfer of care. So the full MDT has to be involved in that process and has to be optimizing the patient within their care before it then becomes a delayed transfer of care. It's a really important little point. We often hear the term delayed transfer of care. It very much seems to be medical focused. So as soon as somebody's medically optimized, it then becomes a delay. Actually, based on this document, it's not. The NICE guidelines, so the transition between inpatient hospital, sorry, just cut people entering the webinar there. The transition between inpatient hospital settings and community or care home settings for adults with social care needs. In that document, it states that adults with social care needs who are admitted to hospital have existing care plans shared with the admitting team. It says that older people with complex needs need a comprehensive geriatric assessment started on admission. It says that adults with social care needs who are in hospital have a named discharge coordinator, and that's from the very beginning of their stay. It says that adults with social care needs are given a copy of their agreed discharge plan before they leave hospital, and that those with social care needs have family or carers involved in discharge planning if they are providing support after discharge. The reducing delays document then reinforces that by saying that there is too much focus on the assessment to meet people's long-term needs in hospital. It says that we must ensure that only simple assessments are made at the point of discharge. That's an interesting point. I'm not sure about the people about you watching this and watching me say that, but I know from my experiences in a hospital setting, it certainly didn't feel like there were many people I was involved with who at the time I would have classed as being requiring simple assessments. But we'll come on to what it means by simple later. I think often pace in the hospital setting is what creates complexity and not necessarily the need or the assessment itself. You might disagree, but that's just on my experience. But pace creates complexity. It says that we need to ensure that providers of post-hospital care are held to account for the outcomes they're expected to deliver, and for example, reduction in readmissions. So if you've got systems in place that allow for somebody to go home quickly, and you've got a community service that says they can meet that need, they should be held to account if it doesn't work. It says in the document that it's not possible to eliminate all delays, and that there are situations that require complex assessments, such as placement, safeguarding, or someone with complex health needs. But these should be marked as exceptions and not day to day. So it is giving us scope to say that people are allowed to stay in hospital. Complex health needs, I guess that's interpretation. You know, what are we calling complex health needs? And the fact that it says health needs and not social or functional needs is interesting, but that's picked up a little bit later. It's that document that provides the patient flow chart that some of you might be familiar with. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but essentially it shows what the flow and assessment processes should be at different parts of that hospital admission right through to discharge. The Hospital Discharge Service for Policy and Operating Manual of last year. This is a really important document for anybody working in hospital settings or involved in that transition from hospital to home should know about. It's within this document that it provides the criteria to reside. So the criteria to reside is a list of criteria by which somebody is able to remain in hospital, and it's predominantly medically focused. Just find the document here. So it's predominantly medical focused. It looks at things like, obviously, if you're requiring ITU or HDU care, if you're still requiring an IV or oxygen therapy. I'm not going to go through the list of medical reasons why you need to be in hospital, but the reason I put it up there is that one of the criteria to reside is acute functional impairment in excess of home or community care provision. It's a really interesting one for us to know about. So it's not saying that you need to have a medical condition or a medical need to remain in hospital. The criteria to reside, I'll repeat it, includes acute functional impairment in excess of home or community care provision. Now, how you determine in excess of home or community care provision, I suggest is going to change from location to location. And what you consider to be community care is going to change. So is the opportunity to provide someone with short-term respite, does that mean you can meet their community need, even though you can't meet their functional one at home, if you can't get care or rehabilitation in place, say, for example? Or actually, is it optimizing that person's ability to engage in functional activity or meaningful activity once they get home, with limited support afterwards? But it's really important that we know that that is a criteria to reside. So you don't have to be medically unwell to be in hospital. It's from this document where we first start, where it starts talking about, it's not where we first start hearing about discharge to assess, but it's where, because of everything else that's happened in 2020, it's reinforced. So that's why it's a really important document to look at. And it talks about discharge to assess, the model and its pathways. It talks about the discharge to assess stages. So where that is stage one being immediately as somebody's admitted to hospital, that's stage one, right through to that point of discharge. It's quite important to know what it says within each of those stages. But what it does say within the stages is that everybody needs to be reviewed daily and identify all people in that unit or on that ward for discharge on that day. So as part of your board round or handover or whatever it is you're doing that, and that probably happens already. It talks about the details of how to discharge people, talks about the assessment and care planning at home. Really what it says is that discharge to assess is a model and not an assessment in its own right. So it's a longer process from the minute somebody is either brought in to hospital by an ambulance or walks in and is admitted. So as soon as somebody is admitted to hospital, it's a really important point, they are part of the discharge to assess process. And quite often I hear people when I'm doing supervision, or have heard it from in the past when I've been working in those services, is it's identified as this person is discharged to assess, or that person is discharged to assess. That isn't how discharge to assess works. Everybody is part of a discharge to assess process. It then becomes about what pathway within discharge to assess does that person need to follow. It's an important distinction. Discharge to assess defined is where people who are clinically optimized and do not require an acute hospital bed, but may still require care services, are provided with short-term funded support to be discharged to their own home where appropriate, or another community setting. The assessment for longer term care and support needs is then undertaken in the most appropriate setting and at the right time for the person. So essentially, it's reinforcing what I just said. It's a process by which people are assessed for discharge home, and for that 6 weeks post-discharge. That's still part of that discharge to assess process. Longer term needs can be assessed afterwards. So it is about that flow through hospital, but that doesn't mean that it's the point of somebody saying, yes, they're ready for home, they're medically optimized, they need to go home today. The whole point of that process is that there's a build up to that. So needs are identified through part of that inpatient stay, through accurate and robust and multidisciplinary assessment. And then as that person is ready to leave, it isn't a shock to the team, it's just part of that process. It's a build up to that lead home so that things can be put in place to support that transition. But it's very much around those shorter needs. Suppose meeting essential criteria in old money, making sure that the critical needs can be met. What else the document does is explain the pathways. So stage one I'll come at the pathways in a sec. So it's stages and pathways within the stages. So stage 1, like I said, it's the minute somebody comes into hospital. Stage 2 is where these pathways are determined. So it says that 50% of people will be a simple discharge, need no input from health or social care. This is based on their audits for the document. So 50% of people will be a simple discharge, will need no requirement from health and social care, and likely require no multidisciplinary assessment on their unit or on their ward. So that's pathway 0. So within stage 2, you have these pathways. Pathway 0 goes home. It's a nurse-led, ward-led discharge, doesn't require anything else. Pathway 1 within that, so it says there are 45% of our caseloads. They'll require some support to recover at home. They'll be able to return home with support from health and or social care. Now, predominantly, I would suggest that is where our therapy caseload comes from, our inpatient wards. It says pathway 2 is 4% of those people who require inpatient rehabilitation in a bedded setting. So I'm going to come on to myth busting far later in the webinar, but it's really important that we understand that inpatient rehab is built in to a discharge to assess process. It's really important because I hear a lot of feedback from therapists who are concerned that inpatient rehabilitation is being shunned or pushed to the wayside because of a discharge to assess model or discharge to assess process that's maybe being misused. It's built in to this process that 4% of people statistically are likely to require inpatient rehabilitation. So it's really important that current inpatient rehabilitation settings are resourced effectively to allow that to continue to happen. It is not saying that within discharge to assess, people can't stay in hospital for the right reasons. Absolutely not. And pathway 3 is 1% of people who had a life-changing event and home isn't an option, and they'll go straight from an acute setting into a more formal care setting. Within stage 3 of the process, so this is within stage 2, this is determined, these assessments are carried out, the decisions are made, and then within stage 3, case managers with partner organizations will then make sure that things are in place for that to happen. So this, what you're seeing on the screen here, is determinations within stage 2, and then stage 3 is actually putting what's needed in place. So that's the actual discharge plan itself. I hope that makes sense. But if you've got any questions about that, just ask Kate, and she can put some specifics to me in case I'm not articulating that well enough. The principles of discharge to assess, you can see the list there. I'm not going to regurgitate them, but the ones I want us just to quickly focus on are personalized support, maximizing of independence, home is best, and discharge preparation. So personalized support is an interesting one because it often feels like within acute settings, we're moving as far from personalized support as we possibly can. But what it refers to is if this process is carried out properly and how it's intended, would be that the support the person requires when they leave hospital is client-centered, it's patient-centered, and it's specifically designed around their needs. That's the idea. It's maximizing independence. That's one of the core principles of discharge to assess. So maximizing independence, I mean, this is OT core language. So this is something that we should be really happy about. Maximizing independence could be ensuring the right reablement is in place when somebody leaves hospital. It could be making sure the right equipment's in place when someone leaves, whether they're incredibly dependent or not, to make sure that the little independence that person might have is maximized. But it could also be that we feel that the 6 weeks of post-discharge reablement isn't going to be enough to help that person reach their potential in maximizing their independence, in which case we have the flexibility and the authority within discharge to assess to recommend inpatient rehabilitation, so that when that person does then leave the inpatient environment to have a reablement service, we are confident clinically that that will help them maximize their ability to engage in meaningful activity and independence, and with the impact that has on long-term care and health and well-being. And discharge preparation. So again, it's a really important principle within discharge to assess. And I'm pointing it out specifically because stuff we're going to come on to later. So it's preparation. So this is not about determining that somebody can go home out of the blue and then them leaving without their needs being met. This is about preparing for discharge in the right way. But it's certainly not about saying this person is discharged to assess. The lady in bed B4, she's discharged to assess because she's going home today. That's a misapplication of discharge to assess. It should still be a planned and prepared discharge process, according to the legislation. So the intended impact is to create positive flow through the hospital system, to have ongoing and timely assessment through the patient's stay. Note there how it doesn't say that you only assess somebody in their own home. It says ongoing and timely assessment throughout the patient's stay. And it says we need to ensure assessments are client-centered and conducted in an appropriate environment to determine long-term needs or potential. Now, don't forget, it's already been ascertained that the guidance legislation says often that there's too much focus on long-term need in a hospital setting. So what it's suggesting is that the assessments carried out within that environment are appropriate to get that person home safely, so that other long-term needs might be able to be determined when they're in their own environment. But it does say ensure assessments are client-centered and conducted in an appropriate environment. It's not saying there are no ward-based or inpatient assessments. So just to reinforce that, discharge to assess is a process and not a single leap or often a perceived push from a medical optimization to home or community. That's not what it's intended to be. And we'll come back to all this later when we put that in the mix with what our job actually is. Yeah, so there is no intention within the guidance to remove therapists from the hospital setting. It's a myth. I think to move that on, hopefully that's covered some of the dry legislation stuff, but I think it's really important that if we're reflecting on what discharge to assess is, we understand the terminology and what it actually says and what it doesn't say, and how that matches with some of our perceptions or some of the things we've seen. Now, I think if we're going to think about the impact on us as therapists, but probably more importantly on our patients and their occupations, we'll just quickly refresh what we mean by occupation. I know sometimes, certainly in a hospital setting and in the local authority, sometimes we have to take a step back and think, okay, what is it I'm helping people do here? Just so that we make sure that we're not on a conveyor belt of being discharge planners. So I just wanted to put this in, the definition in, just to reinforce that. So the World Federation definition of occupation is the everyday activities that people do as individuals, in families, and within communities to occupy time and bring meaning and purpose to life. Occupations include things people need to do, want to do, and are expected to do. And there's always some key words to pull out of that. And I do this, if ever I'm talking about the definition, I always make sure I pull out and reinforce the key words. So meaning and purpose, I'm going to come on to that in a few slides' time about the difference and my experience from a hospital setting about what that means to me. But the final sentence, so occupation includes need, want, and expectation. Now, we might be very good in certain clinical environments, certainly hospital, local authority maybe, absolutely, in meeting need because they're the basics. What I'm curious for us to think about and reflect on is what would need to change within those settings for us to really, particularly the hospital setting, because that's where I'm coming from, but anybody who's watching this working in councils or local authorities, obviously the same applies to you. how often or what opportunities do we have, or what would need to change for us to be able to consider need, want, and expectation? I'm obviously not expecting answers right now, but I think that's something we need to reflect on and remember, that we are not just need-led professions, even though it might feel like we're working in need-led services. And the Royal College define occupational therapy as someone who will consider all of the patient's needs, physical, psychological, social, and environmental. It says that support can make a real difference, giving a renewed sense of purpose, opening up new horizons, and changing the way you feel about the future. And I'm not sure we can all, certainly myself, if I reflect on my practice, certainly at the beginning of my career within hospital setting, is that I really thought about want and expectation, or whether people who I'd supported discharges for, whether I can honestly say I opened up their new horizons and gave them a renewed sense of purpose. I certainly think I'll have met their critical needs, which I'm sure they were very grateful for. And at the time, it might have been what was the most important thing to them in that acute situation. So I'm not saying at the time I've done them a disservice, but it does make me reflect on what would need to change, or what processes would need to change, or what cultural mindsets would need to change for me to feel like I was absolutely practicing occupational therapy within that setting. So what do we do at the minute as within inpatient settings? What service, what assessments do we provide? And we'll try and think about how we reflect on how that might change. So these are just a list of my experiences. You'll have your own, I'm sure. Some of them might be the same, some of them might be different. Some of them you might look at and think, why do they do that? Everyone's going to have their own experiences. So from my experience, standard things would have included standard transfer assessments, personal care assessments, kitchen assessments, site visits. So going home to somebody's home without them to check their home environment. Home assessment visits, where you take the person to that environment if there's something you're not sure about their interaction with it. They would kind of be the standard sorts of things. My question there is, if we engage people or help people engage in meaningful activity, how much that I've done within those assessments is truly meaningful? Or is it actually purposeful? The purposeful is fine, because occupation is meaning and purpose. But a few years ago, I might have described what I did, or what we did as a service, as helping people engage in meaningful occupation. Actually, when I look back now, I wonder whether that was true in the long term, or whether we were focusing on purpose because of that critical need. And how did we do that? So we applied activity analysis to that objective assessment. We considered transferable skills and needs, and then we applied that activity analysis to activities that the person might do in their own environment. Now, one of the things for us to consider there is, I think it does inpatient services an injustice to presume that somebody needs to be in their own environment for that assessment to be accurate and robust. The idea of activity analysis is that is a breakdown of the task, a complex and detailed breakdown of what we see to determine what people might be able to do and achieve, or what support they might need, leading to approaches like rehabilitative, compensatory, adaptive, etc., etc. I don't think, in my experience as an inpatient occupational therapist, whether there were many occasions, when you think about the thousands of patients I must have seen in that time, where there were actually many occasions in the context of those thousands where I wasn't confident with the recommendations I'd made based on what I'd seen within the hospital. Obviously, if you then were unsure about whether there was something involved, something you were seeing that actually was determined by the interaction of the environment, that would then lead you to do something else or suggest something else. I think the important thing within this is the timeliness. So if I was able to, as a hospital-based therapist, provide an assessment or a range of assessments for a patient on an inpatient unit or ward, apply a robust activity analysis, come up with conclusions that are clinically reasoned based on a robust evidence base, and have them in place in time for the person to leave before they were medically optimized, or certainly as they became medically optimized, then that is part of the discharge to assess process. So that's within that stage 2 process. We don't need to wait. We don't need to hold off until somebody's medically optimized and say they are discharged to assess. What I was doing was part of a discharge to assess process, which just hadn't been termed discharge to assess yet. And that's backed up with the legislation. So it talks about the timeliness of assessment leading to patient flow. So if I'm not holding that up, then what's the issue? And I understand there are times where we do need to see somebody in their own environment. And at that point, yes, absolutely. If they're medically well enough to go on a home visit, say, for example, then why are they not just going home and it being picked up at home? Or you facilitating that discharge home? But it's part of that seamless process. Like I say, I think it does therapists a disservice by saying you need to see everybody at home who has a need, because that limits the scope of activity analysis. Surely that's what that's there for. And actually, it's been a couple of years since I worked in a hospital service, but I know before I left, we did an audit at the time, because we were talking about discharge to assess, to determine how many patients within our caseload actually were waiting for therapy to finish after they were medically optimized. And at that time, so for the previous 12 months, it was somewhere in the region of 90 to 93% of our caseload were therapy ready for discharge before they were medically optimized. And you might not share those experiences, but certainly at that time, that's what our service was doing. So really, only 7% of that caseload then would have had a changed process. Because if they hadn't been therapy ready at the time of being medically optimized, it may well have been that could have been continued in the home environment. But 90 to 93% of our caseload were ready to go and safe before a consultant or a medic said, yes, they are medically optimized. I hope that makes sense. So that leads me on to the issue of the environment. So does the environment affect meaning or purpose? So to make that simple, I've defined purpose as the how. So how do we do something, and the meaning as the why. It's interesting, meaning and purpose. I'd give an example of say, a kitchen assessment in a home environment. And I know we have that age old, or they got me to make a cup of tea. And I'm not trying to be facetious about it at all. But my question is, and to reflect on it, is that purposeful or is it meaningful? Just because somebody does it at home, they make themselves a drink, it doesn't make it meaningful. It's the why, I think, that makes it meaningful. So why do you do that? Now, if it's, well, I'll obviously make a drink because I'm thirsty, then yes, but that still could be purpose. The meaning for me is more, so do you do it when people come round? Does it help you engage socially? Why do you get dressed in the morning? And it's not because you have to, it's because not the act of getting dressed, but what you are doing once you are dressed, that you have to be dressed to then go and do, is the meaningful. So what I'm asking there is, does the environment change that? And it's likely, based on my own reflections, again, it might not be yours, but on my own reflections, is that A lot of the hospital assessments that I was involved with, actually, when I look back, I was focusing on purpose and not meaning. And that's fine, because occupation, like I said, covers purpose and meaning. But I didn't want to fool myself that I was then helping that person engage in meaningful activity, because I probably wasn't asking the right questions. I was asking questions more about how do you do that, rather than why do you do it. And bathing is a great example for that. So if you do currently complete bathing assessments in a hospital, what are you asking and analysing? And I'm well aware there'll be services and people who often say, well, we just don't conduct bathing assessments in hospital because it's not a critical need, maybe, for example. But I still think a lot of that is based on how we determine bathing. And in my experience, bathing, I conducted in the past bathing assessments as a transfer assessment. It's how do you do it? Can you get in and out? If you can't get in and out safely and independently, what can I put in place to make that happen? That's a transfer assessment, but it's a transfer in and out the bath. What I wasn't necessarily addressing was the why. So actually the much more important question for something like bathing and everything else, but I'm using bathing as the example, is why do you bathe? And ask yourselves, why do you bathe? Is it to have a wash? And it's often not. It's to relax, to unwind. Things that generally support mental health rather than physical health or personal hygiene. So if that's why you bathe, and by that I mean submerge in water, so we get down into a bath. If that's why you bathe, when we make recommendations for equipment to support hospital discharge, or as part of that 6-week post-discharge discharge to assess process, if we're giving somebody a bit of equipment to do that, what are we impacting on? We can't know what we're impacting on unless we've asked the why question. Because if somebody gave me a bit of basic bathing equipment to help me get in and out of the bath, but actually what made bathing meaningful to me was my ability to bathe with a young child, if I've just, if I'm a father and I've got a baby and I want to be able to bathe with them, or if actually I use the bath to relax and unwind, and to do that I need to be able to lie right back and submerge in water, and I'm 6'1", so that makes that really difficult. But you might say, well, I'm meeting a critical need because you go and wash everything you need to. That's based on how and not why. So what I'm asking there is to consider, what is it about a discharge to assess process that might make those assessments more client-centered, more holistic, and more meaningfully occupation focused? So how would discharge to assess change this? Some of this reinforces things we've already said. So pathway 0, simple discharge, 50% of people, very limited number of follow-ups, but it's for things like removal of stitches. Unlikely to have any change to occupational therapy provision for this patient group. But that is a discharge to assess pathway. So everybody who goes home with nothing and doesn't need it, they are still discharged to assess. They are part of that discharge to assess process. I can't reinforce that enough. The pathway 1 is to support to recover at home, which is the 45% of people that I previously mentioned. Determine care needs over the last 24 hours of admission through simple assessment, but that doesn't mean you just get involved within the 24 hours. It means the 24 hours prior to the person needing to be discharged. What is the feedback from the MDT about what that person's needs are? And it might be that that's predominantly nursing. It might be that's predominantly physiotherapy. It might be that it's a mixture of everything. But we've got an opportunity to share what that person's occupational needs are, and not just from a handover. It's building up to that. It then says that you alert single point of access or dedicated discharge to a team, and you meet the immediate health and social care assessment in the home environment, and that's if it's required. So the idea is that best practice, you have assessments leading up to discharge. The discharge happens. What's stopping that? What would traditionally be stopping that from happening and get that need met in the community? One of the things I've highlighted in there, so this shows the discharge to assess process. I've cut off the top because they're the top two. So one's straight into care home, one's to rehab. I really want to focus on the discharge home for this bit. So you've got 50% there on the left hand of the column, going home, don't require any assessment from us. It might need a very brief assessment of function. or mobility, but they go home, they don't need anything. The other 45% require more ongoing assessment or have more needs. What's interesting within that process, and this is within the legislative document, is that what I've put the square around that box, it's around the access to community beds if there is a crisis. It also talks about being able to hold the acute bed if there's any uncertainty about whether the need's going to be able to be met, so the person can transfer back if required. I'll just bring up the point here. I think I've probably got it later on, but I think it's probably a good place to bring it up. I had a colleague of mine, a former colleague of mine, put a really interesting point on one of the posts in promoting the webinar. And that was about, I can't remember the exact wording, but it was something along the lines of discharge to assess, just being a new term, a new word, meaning what would have been traditionally a discharge home visit. And I'm interested by that because it's not. But I completely understand why that might be the perception. And I'm going to talk about it here briefly because when I first moved into a senior role within acute setting, we were very much told, discharge home visits are, under very specific circumstances only because of the perceived risk. Because so much has to work around it. So by discharge home visit, what I mean is if it works, the person stays. If it doesn't, you bring them back. Rather than a traditional home visit where you're taking them home to try a few things out, bring them back, put things in place. So we were very much told you can do it, but you need 2 therapists to go and to do it. It's not what would have otherwise been a therapist and a member of the support team. It's under very specific circumstances and it doesn't happen very often. What I see discharge to assess being applied often as looks like a glorified discharge home visit, where we're just saying, where it might be said, right, they're medically optimized, they need to go, get them home, and then the assessments can be conducted in the home environment. That I understand how that's perceived as a new glorified discharge home visit. I hope what I'm saying, what you're getting from the legislation and the guidance is that that's a misapplication of discharge to assess. And that's why those perceptions are around and why people will probably share them. It's a misuse of discharge to assess. Discharge to assess is a process and not a one-off assessment, which has significant risk, given that you don't know whether community needs are going to need to be met or whether somebody's going to have a bed to go to should it not work, as would have been the risk in a discharge home visit. So let's try and think about it more now from an occupational therapy perspective. What are the opportunities with discharge to assess? So it talks about case management or specialist assessors. I think there's a real opportunity there for occupational therapists to take on the role of that case management or the specialist assessor role as part of that transition from hospital to home. So it doesn't mean that hospital therapists need to stay in hospital all the time. Although, like I've said a number of times, there's absolutely nothing that suggests that occupational therapists aren't needed in the hospital. But wouldn't it be great to consider our ability to transition home with that person rather than it being a handoff to another so-called discharge to assess team in the community who is already stressed and trying to keep people out of hospital in the first place. So that would be new skills both for community-based therapists and hospital-based therapists. Because the idea would be, and it's point 4 on that list, the idea would also be that as you're involved with somebody in the community, wouldn't it also be fantastic if you transitioned into the hospital with them to be the support that that hospital multidisciplinary team needs to then get that patient home in a timely manner. So you've got that constant transition and role changing, I guess, of therapists from community to hospital, supporting individual or groups of patients. That requires some development of different skills. the ability to focus on application of specialist skills, like I've just suggested. So rather than it being embroiled in things that we may not need to be involved with. I'll use the example of equipment here. So it may be that, and that's my experience, that at the time, sometimes we can be a little precious about certain things that have become part of the occupational therapy department's role. But actually, when we reflect on why we do them and why we're so precious about them, that might be slightly less clear. So, for example, when I was still in the hospital service, there was a bit of a pushback on other services being deemed competent or going through competencies to deliver and fit equipment. And that might be through voluntary services like the Red Cross or St. John's or any voluntary, Age UK, any voluntary service community-based that were used as part of the discharge to assess process. And there was a bit of a query there as to why is that happening. And I guess probably a threat that, well, if that's being taken off us and we see it as an occupational therapy role, is there then a political move for us to stop doing what we're currently doing? But actually, when we take a step back on that, we're not equipment provider as therapists. Our job is not to provide equipment. Our job is to provide robust, occupation-focused assessment based on things that our patients tell us are meaningful to them, to support that safe transition. It doesn't necessarily mean that we need to be the ones going and fitting the equipment. That stands to reason. So what I'm trying to say there is there's opportunities for other services to pick up some of the things that we've enveloped as occupational therapy roles that would allow us to really strip back and focus on us being occupational therapists within those environments, rather than being discharge planners, which is sometimes what we feel like we have become, or there's the risk that we could become. It's definitely an opportunity for skill development from all sectors, and that's really relates to what I was talking about, that cycle of transition from community to hospital and back. I know certainly as a hospital therapist in the past, I wouldn't have had a clue what the processes were for my community therapists who were going through DFG work, say for a client. I would now, but wouldn't it be fantastic if actually therapists had such rounded skills that not only were they able to follow the person home as part of that 6-week transition, but remain that family's or that client's specialist assessor for the period of the meeting of their care need. Obviously requires investment and resources. I'm not saying that's simple, but wouldn't that be a fantastic gold standard opportunity? If the system supports long-term involvement, like I'm suggesting, it helps us build relationships with patients and clients. So you could be with that person for the lifetime of their adaptation or the lifetime of their rehab. So rather than handing that person over to a reablement service as that specialist assessor or case manager as part of that discharge to assess process, you could be the one going to review that 6-week reablement because you've set the original goals. So why not go and review them and set new ones? And using current professional relationships built in the community to ensure a safer, more efficient and a comfortable hospital stay. Again, that either relates to seamless working with community services around what does that person currently need or want, how responsive could we be to meeting new needs, or in fact, gold standard, why doesn't that therapist follow them into the hospital as part of that full admission and discharge process. So again, I've used bathing as that example because I used it from the previous. So if you consider the bathing assessment we discussed earlier, how would you feel if you were able to assess the person in their own environment, focus on want and expectation as well as need, and discover what is meaningful to that patient and make recommendations that maximize the engagement in that activity? Effectively, what I'm saying is how would it make you feel if you were able to see that through as that person's therapist? Build that relationship, find out more about what is meaningful to them and help them solve that. So and go through that process with them. Now, it may be for the 6 weeks of discharge to assess, but if your service is able to have the resources, it could also be for the lifetime of that potential adaptation. So why not have a therapist who can support that person out of hospital and organise the installation of their specialist bath, rather than provide them with a board to leave hospital with and hand it over to somebody else to see it through. I'm not saying that lightly, so please don't be listening thinking, well, that's a fantastic idea, but it's an absolute pipe dream. I understand the challenges of that. I'm just trying to say, in theory, with the right resources, discharge to assess would support that kind of clinical process. So challenges to that, and it might feel like there are a lot. Culture. So no doubt a changing process for many organizations and professional teams. The culture within medical environments in some places might resist that ongoing opportunity to assess on an ongoing basis, because the focus is on medical optimization. There's no doubt that culturally there are things within our own profession that we may not want to give over, and we don't like the idea of, we hear the term generic working. It's not something that we particularly like, but so it's a cultural challenge. But I think discharge to assess, as I've presented it, is something that we could get our heads around. Trust between professional teams and professions, obvious. It seems straightforward, but it's not. We need to make sure that we trust other teams and our multidisciplinary colleagues. Resources, so equipment, services, adaptations, teams, care, is it all in place? Is it available? Is re-ailment there when we need it? Equipment services, do they work 7 days a week? What happens when something isn't a standard piece of equipment? I've had rhetorical information about equipment services. Once somebody's at home, changing the prioritization criteria for that patient because their top priority is for a discharge and they don't class this as a discharge anymore. Things like that have to change. One of the biggest is obviously therapist resources. So are there even enough therapists to do this properly? But if there's not, and a discharge to assess is being misused, then it also creates issues around safety. I've heard a number of stories from other people, but also when I've done reflection for therapists, community-based therapists, who've said we're getting calls all the time to say somebody's been discharged home, they've been put on their bed, and they've been being hoisted in hospital for the last 2 weeks, and they've got no equipment at home. What do we do? And that's the honest answer is you resolve it as safely and quickly as you possibly can, but that is not discharge to assess. That is quite simply an unsafe and inappropriate discharge. That is nothing to do with discharge to assess. So quickly, some myth busting. So it is not about discharging people from hospital before they're clinically ready. It's not about discharging people without assessment for services required. It's not about moving people home from hospital without the right support. It's not about creating additional transfers in a person's care pathway in order to free up a bed. It's not about moving people without clear pathways and processes, including an agreed care plan. In fact, they should have a care plan and a discharge plan in their hand before they leave hospital. And as I've previously discussed, it is not a glorified discharge home visit. Finally, it does not detract in any way from the need for agreed multi-professional assessment or from the requirements to assure safe discharge, and it may work alongside time for recuperation, recovery, ongoing rehabilitation, or re-ailment, and that's from the NHS and Department of Health document. That statement is incredibly important. So running out of time a little, I know I've talked a lot, so we haven't got an awful lot of time left. So I'm not going to go through those statistics specifically, but needless to say, when it works really well. So the evidence suggests when it goes wrong, it goes badly wrong. What I would suggest, based on what I've read and my reflections and speaking to other therapists, is that when it goes wrong, that it isn't discharge to assess's fault. It's organizational. It's an organizational issue about the misuse of discharge to assess and its values, where it's become more about getting people through hospital quickly and less of a focus on actually what is safe, what is appropriate, and what is timely. And that just reinforces that. So when it goes wrong, is it actually as a result of discharge to assess, or is it an organizational application of the model? In summary, the aim of discharge to assess shares a lot of common values with occupational therapy. The legislation and guidance doesn't support unsafe discharges or unilateral decision making. The significant professional benefits to occupational therapy practice and the appropriate rollout of discharge to assess, I strongly believe that. And it's about home-based assessments that are conducted in a timely manner, but it does not mean there are no hospital-based assessments. What I would encourage people to do after the session is to go onto the Abacus Academy website with the link that you provided with, and it's on there on the slide as well. There's a reflection document which links the HCPC audit sections as well, so you can use it as part of your portfolio and reflect on whether what you thought you knew before has changed, whether it might have changed your practice, whether it might allow you to put some pressure on commissioners or organizations who are actually applying this in a way that might be inappropriate, or whether actually to give praise to services that are doing a really good job of it. But it's there for you to use alongside sections which cover a little bit more about clinical reasoning, around evidence-based practice, and about legislation. It's all on the Abacus Academy site, which is ready to go for you to look at. There's bite-sized videos on there as well. So if you haven't got much time, they're only about 3 minutes long, and hopefully they'll help you reflect on this and other things in future practice. So I'm very aware that I've run over a bit there. So thank you for the lots of people who stayed on. Kate, if you're there, are there any questions that you want to put to me specifically from what people have typed?